right, welcome to Blue Honey Radio. I am Andrew, and this is episode number 4 of the Lost Interviews. As always, you can visit bluehoney.org for this episode's corresponding webpage. There you will find detailed information, images, web links, and all sorts of good stuff. If you enjoy these podcasts, you can show your support in several different ways. One of the best ways you can support this podcast is to make a pledge on patreon.com. You can pledge any amount you'd like per episode, even $1. Okay, so let's unwrap some Christmas traditions with Dr. Patrick Harding. In this holiday episode of The Lost Interviews, we travel to Sheffield, England. One of the things I learned during my visit with Patrick was a lot of the cars in the UK have diesel engines. I was feeling really proud of myself for being able to navigate all over London event-free. Sheffield was a few hours north of my hotel in London, and from there I was about to drive back to London and then to Dover, where I would take a ferry to France and then drive through Paris and then on to Orléans and then even further into the middle of nowhere to a little chapel near Marigny. I'll tell that story another day, but at this point, driving on the opposite side of the road was not that big of a deal, and just when I was finally in my comfort zone, and just before getting completely lost for about an hour, I put regular fuel in the diesel engine of my rental car. I had no idea, and the car made it all the way to Patrick's house, but by the time we finished our interview, the car was dead, and no one could come out to fix it until the next day. So, long story short, Dr. Patrick Harding, among many other things, has a warm heart and a very comfortable couch. Dr. Harding has been an author and a lecturer for over 3 decades. He's lectured at Sheffield University for 20 years, and he now runs numerous courses and works with the BBC on programs about herbal medicine, wildflowers, mushrooms, and trees. But the reason I wanted to interview Patrick is because he's an expert on the origins of our modern-day Christmas traditions. And as I was preparing for this podcast, I realized one of those traditions has been all but lost. So this year, let's bring back the tradition of Boxing Day.
Can I just ask very quickly, do you have that in America or not, Boxing Day?
No.
I didn't
Most
eat it.
people
Okay,
in America
that's what I wondered.
would think that you're watching a fight on television.
Right, okay, lovely, okay. Well, here in Britain, the day after Christmas Day, December the 26th, is commonly known as Boxing Day. And it is actually a big day in the sporting calendar, particularly for hunting and racing, but actually not for this sort of boxing. And Boxing Day gets its name from different sorts of boxes. We can go way back in time to the church, early medieval times, when alms money was collected in a box at the back of a church. And that would be collected throughout the year. And on Christmas Day, the vicar would take the money and count it, and the following day it will be distributed to the poor people of the parish. That was part of the Boxing Day. We can actually take it back to Saturnalia, as with so many things, because they used to save their money for Saturnalia, the Romans, in a sort of box. So we could go back that far. We can come on to Victorian times, when it was more a question of giving money still to the poor, but now not so much the church, sometime it was the rich big houses. And then the people who were doing the work for the rich, the joiners, the carpenters, the people who delivered the milk and everything else, they hit on a rather good idea of going round just before Christmas to ask for a little treat in a little box. And they would offer up this box and the money would be put in, and then on Christmas Day they would open the box, sometimes break it open and share it out between the tradesmen. And I remember as a child leaving money out for the dustman, for the postman, for the paper boy. It's hardly done anymore. This aspect of Christmas giving on Boxing Day is, I think, a custom that we're losing in a way a little sadly, but then these days often one doesn't see anybody anymore. The great big dust cart goes by, maybe one goes and collects one's own newspaper, so there is perhaps less of the service people that we would have known throughout the year. But Boxing Day, it still is, and we still have a holiday.
So after viewing religion through the lens of mythology with Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy in episode 2, let's apply that same perspective to the story of the Nativity.
Well, I've been giving talks for 15, 20 years now in England, and it just amazes me how little people know about the Nativity, even those people who seem to think that they are Christian. So I think a lot of the story has been lost. I think a lot of the meaning has been lost, and I think that's a pity.
And I couldn't agree more. Whether it's the story of the Nativity or the entire life of Jesus, I've always said that I gain more from the Christian story when I approach it as a myth than I ever did by taking the story literally. But things get really interesting when you dig into the myth deeply enough to uncover its origin, because then the concept of taking the story literally takes on a whole new meaning.
One of the things I do at the start of my talk is to try and upset people. I'm afraid that's the way I am. And I always ask the audience, where was Jesus born? And we always get the story about being turned away from the inn and ending up in a stable and being put in a manger. Well, yes, we do have the gospel account of Mary laying Jesus in a manger. And certainly in England, if people want to go find a manger, they'll go to a stable. But 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, they didn't have stables, but they had a lot of mangers. It's reckoned that most people's houses would have had a manger, but it would have been in their front room. And we had similar houses here in Britain at the same age, because people brought their animals into their house at night. They were their most prized possessions, and they didn't want them stolen. They didn't want wild animals getting at them. So you had an earthen, probably a sandy floor in the Middle East, and the animals came in and they needed drink and they needed food. So you had a manger. And it's my belief, and it's many biblical scholars' beliefs, that that was the interpretation of Jesus being laid in a manger. We weren't in a special building, we weren't in a stable, we were almost certainly in somebody's front room, and no room at the inn. The original word that was translated as inn has, I think, a much more sensible meaning. It can also mean spare room. And I think Jesus went along with Mary to stay with some friends. The spare room was full, not an inn, so they had to stay in the front room, and there conveniently was the manger when the baby appeared. It all makes sense, but it's not quite the story that most traditionalists believe.
Most traditionalists believe the tradition. Personally, I believe the story of Jesus is about several things. One way I like to explain this to myself is to think about the movie The Shining. In the same way Stanley Kubrick could subtly layer several themes into one movie, while the movie itself had a main plot and a main theme of its own, the story of Jesus is no different. I believe that the Jesus character actually existed, but that the supernatural aspects of the story came from both sun worship and shamanism. So when it comes to Christmas, to think of the actual birth date of Christ, for me it just doesn't matter. Because for the story to retain the title, Greatest Story Ever Told, the hero character must be born on December 25th.
The actual birth date of Christ is where I have the biggest difficulty when I'm talking to groups. Because everyone has got this idea that Christmas is fixed, unlike Easter, and it's fixed in most countries on December the 25th. There are still one or two parts of the world where Christians don't use that date. And January the 6th is an alternative date, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church. But certainly in most places it's December the 25th. In fact, if we look at there being shepherds looking after their flocks, well, they normally need to look after their flocks in the Middle East more in the autumn, so that doesn't fit with December at all. The Christian Church didn't even have a Christmas Day until nearly 300 years after the birth of Jesus. And when the Church came to decide what day shall we have Christmas Day, nobody knew. I think this is one of the wonderful things about the whole story, that when Jesus was born, there weren't all sorts of bells ringing and everyone making a note of the date. So the fact that the church didn't know meant that they had to choose a date. And I've spent some time trying to find out why it is that the church based in Rome, and by that time the church had split into different areas, chose December the 25th. And I read a lot of books and they said, well, in Rome at that time you had Saturnalia, you had the Calends, the New Year festival. There were all sorts of things going on. The Jewish Festival of Lights was going on. If you were an early Christian in Roman days, you didn't want to stand out. Good idea to have your celebration when everyone else is having a celebration, and then probably no one will notice. So towards the end of December was a good time. And I nearly bought that. I thought, yeah, that sounds good. And then I read a book about Mithras, about the sun god, about the religion that was very much a favourite religion with the Romans, and which might even have become the central religion of the Roman Empire. It was touch and go as to whether it was going to be Mithraism or Christianity. And I read about Mithraism, and to my amazement discovered that their most important day of the year was December the 25th, the day in which the sun was reborn, not the Son of God. And all of these similarities, and I suddenly realised, hey, perhaps that's why the Christian Church chose December the 25th, in a sense to compete with the religion that certainly was in competition for the top spot in Rome. And yet when I talk to people in England, certainly, and I say, have you ever heard of Mithraism? Most of them stare at the wall. So I think it was a very important day, but the choice was a deliberate choice, not just accidental. But I don't think it had anything to do with the actual day on which Jesus was born.
A deliberate choice based on the origin of the story. And we'll get into the deeper meaning of this date some other time. But so I do think it would be nice if everyone understood how the Christian story was, as Timothy Freak said, literally built upon the older myths, and understand the importance things like sun worship and Mithraism had on the Christian story.
Mithraism, and for that matter the Greek Dionysus, have two things in common with Jesus and with Christianity. And that is that in both cases, both Mithras and Dionysus were purportedly born as miracle virgin births from very young mothers, and equally they both made themselves known as gods. In particular Dionysus, they made themselves known to people that they were something above ordinary people, in Dionysus' case, by turning water into wine. Interestingly enough, of course, Jesus was to do the same thing. One of the things I'm fascinated by is the fact that so many religions, if one can call Greek mythology a religion, Mithraism, Christianity, they share all the same common threads. I find that fascinating, but I know that some people who are deeply religious get very offended if their religion is not separate and different from everybody else's. I don't think they need to be.
I think varying understandings of the same story makes things interesting. I mean, the other option is a universal understanding of the myth, or a universal religion, which is exactly what the word Catholic means, and we've seen how that turned out. So rather than offend anyone by attempting to dissect this Jesus character any further, let's get into some other Christmas traditions like the Christmas tree and Rudolph and Santa Claus. Just how old is this story? Well, when you consider Santa Claus as the mythological evolution of Father Christmas, it could be the oldest story ever told.
One of the other problems I have talking to people about Christmas is that some people say he's called Santa Claus and other people say he's called Father Christmas. I'm conscious that they're two different people. I'm conscious that Santa Claus comes from St. Nicholas, is the religious story coming to us out of Turkey, the Christian story. The Father Christmas figure, I believe, has been with us for thousands and thousands of years and certainly predates the birth of Christ. The Father Christmas figure, yes, a bringer of gifts, a revered figure, but we can see elements of this in Northern Europe, in Norse gods. We can see the Odin figure, the chief god of the Norsemen, riding out of the sky on a horse, this interesting horse with 8 legs, bringing gifts round about the midwinter. Those gifts, though, were gifts of knowledge, perhaps rather more important than the gifts that the modern Santa Claus brings to children. Equally, if we look at Thor, we look at some of the Roman gods, some of the Greek gods, there are similar figures. Thor, of course, the bringer of lightning, and anyone who knows about the history of human beings will know that fire was the most important gift we could ever get. And of course, fire came to us first of all through lightning until we learnt how to make it ourselves. So I think these Father Christmas figures, the Odins, the Thors, the Zeus, many other people, they are all comparable and are part and parcel of the evolution of the modern day figure that is Santa Claus.
So the evolution of the Santa figure into what we know of today, with rosy cheeks, with a round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly.
To my mind, the most important development of the sort of modern Santa Claus figure goes back to the poem written in 1821, I think. There's a bit of debate, early 1820s, in New York by Clement, Clarke, Moore. It's a poem that I suspect is known throughout much of the world. Most people know it as "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," although originally, interestingly enough, it was called "A Visit from St. Nicholas." And that's perhaps not surprising because Clement Clarke Moore was a very religious person. He knew all about the story of St. Nicholas and its link with Christmas and presents coming down the chimney. But what I find fascinating is that Clement Clarke Moore was a little bit of a Tolkien figure in that he was also interested in the folklore and the stories of other people who had emigrated to New York. Probably the nice religious story came out of Amsterdam. After all, it was called New Amsterdam before it was called New York. So many people came from Amsterdam. They would have brought the religious story with them. But there were also many people, of course, who went to the New World from Northern Europe. And I think Clement Clarke Moore would have known about the importance of the shaman figure in Lapland, in Russia, the importance of the healer bringing gifts down the chimney. It would have been just in the opening of the yurt. And fascinatingly, and most importantly, in that poem for the first time, our Santa Claus doesn't ride on a horse as he would have done in Turkey, but comes with a sleigh pulled by reindeer. And of course that takes us straight to Northern Europe and the shamans and those peoples who have been looking after reindeer for thousands of years. So the poem is an important starting point. And although everybody believes it's just the Christian version, I see the two versions fused beautifully in that poem. And from there has come our modern figure.
but the colors Santa wears plays a significant role in the tradition. And the illustrations that went with this poem that so vividly described Santa Claus were not in color.
Sadly, the original illustrations that went with this wonderful poem were in black and white. Later, very famous illustrations, particularly by Thomas Nast, were indeed in colour. And all of this leads me to be the big issue, and that is this figure in the poem coming down the chimney, ho ho, wearing furs. What colour were they? Because, of course, today we have Santa Claus always red and white. But if we look back into Victorian times, look back into the 19th century, sometimes he was white, sometimes blue, sometimes green. And I'm fascinated by the fact that he is really red and white, because that doesn't link again with a saint. A saint from Turkey would have worn grey or dark colours. He wouldn't have been in red and white. A bishop, as he was before he became a saint, Nicholas. But to me, we go back to the northern end of Europe to seek out the red and white. Some people say to me, Patrick, we know why he's in red and white, because of Coca-Cola. Now, the company colours of Coca-Cola are red and white, and in the 1930s, when Coca-Cola was not allowed to be advertised to children, they neatly got round this by showing a Santa figure drinking the famous drink, and he was dressed in the company colours. And everyone says that's why the modern Santa is red and white and not green and not blue. Well, I refute that, because for a start, there are wonderful pictures of a red and white Santa in a book written of all people by Tolkien, his letters to his children, where he pretended to be Santa Claus, or Father Christmas as he called him, and his pictures are of red and white Santas before the Coca-Cola advert. But I know in my heart that the red and white comes not from the religious part of the St. Nicholas Santa Claus story, but from the shaman Father Christmas type. Because if we go to Lapland, you ask a child, where does Santa Claus come from? He'll not say Turkey. He or she will say, of course Santa Claus comes from Lapland or the North Pole. We're back up into Northern Europe. And that is where we had the shaman figures, where we still have the reindeer, where for thousands of years they didn't have alcohol. You can't brew alcohol at minus 60 degrees. The yeast doesn't work. If you're moving your yurt every few weeks to follow these nomadic reindeer, alcohol is a very heavy commodity. What did they use to get out of their heads on a Saturday night instead? The wonderful red and white mushroom, the amanita, the fly agaric. Now, red and white, aha, Santa. Ho, ho, he's going. No, he's not been at the sherry that people have left out at the bottom of the chimney, because Santa is partly based on this northern shaman figure, flying through the air, the experience the shaman would have had having eaten this mushroom, to go and communicate with the gods to find out what is wrong with the sick people. So it links in, to my mind, very carefully, very nicely with this fusion of different sorts of people. It's just that people don't like the idea of Christmas being associated with a drug addict. Well, an awful lot of people get very drunk at Christmas. They drink alcohol. Different parts of Europe, they had something else that they could use. And more fascinatingly, we know that the shamans, if they couldn't get the mushroom, or if someone in their tribe wasn't high enough ranking to be able to take the mushroom, the person just watched the shaman wherever the shaman went for a wee, which is very easy because it makes yellow snow. They'd cut out the snow and they would drink the urine. We now know that the wonderful hallucinogenic chemicals in this fungus pass unaltered into the urine.
And not simply unaltered, but intensified. The active psychedelic ingredient of this mushroom is called mucimol, and as this mushroom passes through your liver, the mucimol is intensified while the ibotenic acid, which can cause some discomfort and sweating and nausea, is decreased, making the urine a stronger psychedelic substance than the mushroom itself.
And what some people were doing was getting pissed. And that is a phrase that we still have today, but we've transferred it to inebriation by alcohol. I just love this mix of different cultures, different backgrounds, different ways of doing things. But the shaman brought gifts, but gifts of healing.
So Patrick mentioned that these shaman were nomadic and that they followed herds of reindeer. So what was it about these shaman that rippled into our modern-day Christmas traditions?
Well, the shamans of Northern Europe, particularly Siberia and Lapland, held a position I don't think very different from shamans of anywhere else around the world, that very important position of a person who acted to help both the physical and the spiritual needs of their people. They were a mixture of a doctor and a religious person, all rolled into one, and a counsellor as well, important people. But the shamans of the area I'm interested in were those who were associated with tribes like the Sami people, who for thousands of years have made their life and their living from reindeer. Not as easy as doing it from, say, cattle or sheep, because reindeer are nomadic animals and they need to move to different pastures, different times of the year. They give birth at different places from where they overwinter. So the people who are looking after them, including the shamans, need to travel, and therefore they need a portable form of tent, a form of yurt in a sense. And they need to be intimately involved with the animals. They help them give birth, they protect them. I find it a wonderful way of life. In return, they get the meat, they drink the blood, they get the milk, they get the skins for their yurts, they get their clothing. It's very much a symbiotic relationship. And the shaman would have been highly important because right up in Northern Europe, there were additional problems of illness. I'm one of these people who come Christmas when the days are getting a bit short, we don't see a lot of sun. I suffer a little bit from SAD, this feeling a bit, ugh. We now know scientifically that we all need sunlight. It makes us feel better. Well, of course, way up in Northern Europe, it's permanent dark. Interesting enough, either side of Christmas. Christmas is the time when the shamans are working overtime because in addition to the usual accidents and illnesses, they've got depression to deal with. And I like to think, therefore, that the shamans would have needed the old red and white mushroom a little bit more around about Christmas. But also they would have helped with the herding of the reindeer. We know that the reindeer also love the red and white mushroom, and sometimes the red and white mushrooms are put out to bring the reindeer down from the mountain areas so that they can be counted, so that they can be culled. There's even lovely examples where reindeers discovered that human urine can sometimes be of interest too. Early travellers had lovely experiences where they went out behind a hut to have a wee and the reindeer came crashing down after them. So, interesting experiences. The shaman, the reindeer, the mushroom, the peoples, and it was part and parcel of it, knowing about the seasons, of realising that one went to the gods to find out what was wrong with someone. The shaman would come in down the chimney. There was only one opening to the yurts. The fire, the smoke from the fire went out that same opening. So coming down the chimney as the typical Father Christmas figure is still there with this earlier shaman figure.
These yurts had just one opening because overnight the snowdrifts would accumulate so much. Even if there was a door on the side, it would be useless. This was the only way in and out of the yurt. And incidentally, this also accounts for the pitter-patter sound of reindeer feet on the rooftop.
But of course the shaman was bringing more important gifts because the gift of healing of a medicine person is, to my mind, much more important than any physical gifts which we often associate with Christmas today.
So this red and white mushroom that we still see everywhere today, as well as the colors that we see around Christmas time, originated in psychedelic mushroom use thousands of years ago. Their actual literal traditions became our festive traditions.
I mean, my belief is that what the shamans would have been doing would have been collecting sufficient fly agarics, the famous red and white Amanita toadstools, obviously first of all for the community, but also to last through the whole year. The problem is that fungi have a fairly short season, and this is particularly true in Northern Europe. They're not going to be coming up during the snow, during the cold period. As it happens, we now know scientifically that if someone was to eat the fresh mushroom, they would not get anything like such an interesting experience, hallucinogenic or otherwise, as using the dried. And this is because one of the chemicals that is in the fungus is converted to a much more powerful hallucinogen when the fungus is slightly warmed or when it is dried. So if we look at the history of the use of the fly agaric, the fact that they were dried in the sun, possibly hung on trees to dry, all sorts of other ways, basically without any knowledge of chemistry at all, these shamans were actually making sure that they got the maximum amount of the powerful hallucinogenic chemical, and they had something that they could keep, that they could use throughout the year. And unlike alcohol, dried mushroom is remarkably light and easy to be moving around with. So I think the whole aspect of the use of this particular hallucinogen is an interesting one, and it, of course, is linked in with where they're growing. Much of Northern Europe, Lapland, Russia particular, has two basic tree types, birch and some form of pine or coniferous wood. They are the most hardy trees in cold northern areas. And the wonderful thing about this fungus is that it's not found on dead wood, it's not found in the middle of grass, it's only found associated with the roots of either birch or conifers, typically species of pine. So we're dead in the right area, but it's interesting that we've got this link of the mushroom with trees, with living trees, because of course many other aspects of religion, not just Christianity, make the tree central, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, the way in which the tree runs from a heaven to an earth to a hell. So I am fascinated by this link with the mushroom and trees. The fact that the red and white mushroom is linked, although sometimes with birch trees, quite often with conifers, with fir trees, makes me wonder whether there is a link with the traditional Christmas tree. The Christmas tree that came out more from Germany, that sort of part of Europe, rather than further north. But the tradition of tree worship is a very important one. And again, shamans would have been involved with tree worship. Tree worship predates Christianity, but of course, tree worship is associated with elements of most religions. And I'm fascinated by the Christmas tree aspect. We know that the Christmas tree came originally from medieval times, where particularly in Central Europe, it was a fir tree. It was a fir tree that was decorated with fruits.
Patrick was pointing at a model of the Amanita muscaria mushroom sitting on a table next to him.
Never know. This is, in a sense, a fruit. And, of course, the forerunner of the baubles that today we hang on Christmas trees.
Right next to the model of the Amanita muscaria were some mushroom-shaped Christmas ornaments.
This rather beautiful one showing a rather closer link with the red and white mushroom and Christmas than some of the ordinary baubles. But going back to medieval times, they dressed a tree with fruits, and it was part of a little play about Adam and Eve. And that then became the paradise tree, which then became the Christmas tree.
which leaves room for an interesting conversation about just what exactly this forbidden fruit was. Today, it's an apple, but the Amanita muscaria mushroom is also a red, bulbous, fruiting body of a tree.
But it's the link with Adam and Eve that I find interesting, because a lot of people know that the 24th of December is Christmas Eve. Some people say because it's the evening before Christmas. It's actually also Adam and Eve's day. And I think Eve is more important, therefore, as the person rather than the evening. On Adam and Eve's day, December the 24th. Also, if we go back to the time of the shamans and others, it was the day in which the Earth Mother, Eve, gave birth. So there's a lot of elements around that aspect. And the story of the tree and Adam and Eve's day brings us nicely back to Christianity. It brings us back to Adam and Eve and the tree of good and evil with a serpent. Now, a long time ago, even when I was at Sunday school as a child, I didn't quite buy the idea of some woman giving me an apple, and having eaten the apple, I suddenly realized that I was naked. Maybe something more powerful. So I reread the bit in the Bible. Of course, it doesn't mention apple. It mentions fruit. This is a fruit.
Pointing at the red and white mushroom next to him.
And all I can say is if a woman gave me this to eat, because of the chemicals in it, I would see things very differently. So I was fascinated to read of an ancient wall painting in a church in France, dating back to the 13th century, I think I'm right in saying.
He was talking about that chapel in Plaine Corault in France, where I was headed just after this interview.
Where Adam and Eve are depicted around the tree with the snake. But it's certainly not an apple tree. And what is coming from the branches of the so-called tree are things that look remarkably like the fly agaric. That, to me, would give much more meaning to the story. But some people tell me, rather boringly, that actually it was a style of painting fir trees in those days, and it's got nothing to do with the mushrooms. I think people can make their own mind up.
I'll tell you all about my visit to that chapel later, but that's it for now. Remember to visit bluehoney.org. Each of these episodes have a corresponding webpage with images and more details. Just go to bluehoney.org, follow the link to Blue Honey Radio, and there you will see this episode listed under the Lost Interviews. And while you're there, be sure to check out our new t-shirts on sale. All of the profits for everything sold on my website will be used to make this podcast better. So, as always, I want to thank everyone for showing your support. For updates and some random thoughts, be sure to follow me on Twitter at bluehoney_org. That's bluehoney_org. Be on the lookout for episode number 5 of the Lost Interviews. In this episode, we talk physics and psychedelics with physicist and author of Quantum Reality, Nick Herbert. Until then, happy holidays and stay tuned, everybody.